Mara Campbell stepped onto her land as the afternoon light poured over the plateau, her boots stirring centuries of dust. She pressed the tattered deed in her hand, its edges frayed but stamped with promise. She inhaled deep. The wind tasted of sun-baked stone and unfulfilled dreams. This was her inheritance now. 160 acres of forgotten land far from towns, bosses, or anyone who'd ever told her who to be. She was both hopeful and terrified. Hope because she was free, terrified because she knew freedom's cost. She dropped her satchel, her trunk, really, a single strong chest that held clothes, letters, and the echoes of the husband she'd left behind. She'd cut the ties that once defined her, but now she felt the weight more than ever. The homestead lay ahead, half-ruined cabin and well, surrounded by fields of hardpan. Not one tree offered shade. Not one memory beckoned her inside. And yet, she stood tall. She would build. She kneaded the ground with her hands, tasting grit beneath her nails. She carved her name, Mara, in the dirt at the cabin's sill. She repeated it, each letter deeper, as though pressing existence into the world. Mara pulled her coat tighter against the breeze, trying to ground herself in purpose. When the wind picked up and rattled the cracked window panes, she didn't flinch. She answered with a steady voice, "I'm here." She spent that first day clearing debris, broken planks, rusted tin, shards of glass. She dragged wood toward the cabin's frame, setting a lean-to that might become shelter. She tested the well pulley, jarring open its mechanism and filling the bucket with dust-flecked water. It frothed under her lips. It tasted of grit, but Mara swallowed it, all of it, seeing grit as the first lesson of survival. Her muscles burned by midday, yet she worked on. With a stone she smashed up old mortar to patch a gap in the wall. She hammered in a plank to fix the door, then paused to close it. The click of latch against jamb reverberated like a heartbeat. Not perfect, but usable. She leaned her forehead against wood, letting the roughness bruise her. Wood and steel and sweat, they reminded her she was still alive. She pulled a bowl from her trunk, transferred some hardtack and a skinned rabbit she salted with powdered sage, and ate quietly while staring into the cabin's interior. She'd slept in this space tonight. She would learn it, make it hers. Night fell, and darkness spread its cloak. She lit a hand-rolled lamp, set it on a plank repurposed as a table, and sat so still she could hear her own heart thump. Somewhere in the distance coyotes called. Mara's throat tightened, but she swallowed and raised the lamp high as though she could shine the fear away. She closed her eyes and let memories chase her, her ex-husband's bitterness, the slammed door, the retreat into herself. They came unbidden, but she didn't fight them. Instead, she let the plate of stale rabbit sit untouched beside her and rested her hands in her lap. She woke early the next day, before dawn, stiff in the joints. Dew coated the grasses beyond the cabin porch. She pushed open the door and stepped outside onto dew-soaked earth. She didn't need to speak to the day, she needed to work. She angled toward the broken well again, replaying yesterday's motions. She rewound the pulley, washed it with a bit of oil from her satchel, then leaned into her full weight and tugged. The bucket fell free, thunking as it hit gravel. She waited. It rose. She waited. It rattled. Then water, thin but present, splashed into the bucket. Her breath caught. She cupped water to her mouth, and tears stung her eyes. Alive. She was alive. This land responded. When the sun rose high, she excavated around the well casing, refilled mortar with stronger clay, reinforced the pulley's hooks. Every swing of the hammer echoed into the hollow canyon. Every shovel of soil removed spoke of faith. When dust choked her, she wiped it free and didn't stop. When her hands bled, she wrapped them in scrap cloth. She didn't care that her palms would harden, they needed to. She didn't care that she tasted iron. This was life. Across the following weeks, she set posts for a fence to protect her meager garden, built a smokehouse to preserve game, trapped rabbits and quail, learned which wild herbs dried into broth. She built shelves inside her cabin and splintered wood into sturdy table legs. She planted barley seed from a torn packet she found in her trunk. She watered it by hand, learned the rhythms of sun and wind. She greeted the barley at dawn, spoke to it as though it were kin. When the sprouts appeared, she crouched and wept tears that tasted like victory. Her back ached. Her body cried out each dawn. She lay on her bed, just a plank with a blanket, listened to the wind howl through the cracks. It rattled bones and souls, she thought, but she would not break. She had to stake this claim, to plant roots in a place that didn't kneel. One evening, as the sky bled red, she discovered tracks by the garden, large paw prints, wild cat. The frontier was not empty. Danger lay beyond the door. Mara didn't tremble. She found her rifle, cleaned its stock, loaded it. She planted sharpened sticks around the perimeter. She fashioned a trap. The next night she slept inside, the rifle beneath her arm, ready. The wild cat didn't come. She called that a victory, too. Months passed. Barley stalks stood knee-high. Her cabin's walls were patched. She built shutters for the windows. She carved a door stain. She fixed the smokehouse's latch. More animals followed the traps. She cured their hides and wove strips for future use. She slept harder, dreamed softer. She learned to carve not just wood, but life. She healed. One morning, she rode the perimeter trail, on foot, barefoot, feeling the ground beneath her soles. She paused where the wild grasses bowed, noticing smooth stones that looked out of place. She bent down, handed them over, cleaned them. Something ancient pulsed beneath this land. She couldn't name it, but she knew it needed respect. She placed the neat stack of stones beside her cabin wall. It felt like speaking a prayer. A season turned. The barley yellowed. The air cooled. Mara harvested grain, threshed it by hand, ground kernels into flour. She baked bread on a flat stone warmed by coals. The first loaf cracked when she sliced it. It tasted of hard work, survival, hope. She sat outside, bread cooling in her lap, and watched the sky turn purple. She gripped the loaf tight, as though it held all she'd become. She took a bite, chewy, dense, imperfect. Tears blurred her vision. She drew breath deep. This was her life, her work, her home. The wind spoke again the next morning, but it spoke differently. No longer the blistering breath of a land testing her resolve. It carried a questioning tone, a voice like tails of rattlesnakes, like feathers brushing sandstone. Mara emerged from her cabin before dawn, yawning against the cold that clung to her spine. A fresh dusting of frost glazed the trough where she drew water. The barley field stood stiff and quiet, stalks frozen in place. She scrubbed her hands in the trough, cupped water to her mouth, then touched the barley patch. The rigid stalks cracked like old bones. She studied them. Frost sheltered this high plateau overnight. Humidity and sunlight would follow. Enough to heal. Enough to bind her claim. She knelt, dug her fingers into earth, allowed her chest to accept cold. She would take on this land, no matter what it whispered. Morning chores blurred. She checked traps laid beneath juniper, found a rabbit caught in a wire noose she'd carved from salvaged fencing. She held the dying creature and closed her eyes, released it with mercy. The land asked blood, but she refused to kill what she had not bred. She pressed her lips to the rabbit's pelt, then skinned it. She baked its meat that night in a flat stone. The barley fed her at dawn. The rhythm steeled her bones. At midday, the wind's tone shifted again. Mara paused mid-frame on the cabin door arch she was constructing. Hammer poised over nail, she froze. A pattern swirled across the ridge, disturbance in stone, dust shifting. A horse. A person. She ducked behind the wallboard. She held her breath. Nothing. Dust settled. She continued nailing. But her heart pounded. When the board clicked into place, she stepped back and studied the horizon. No horse, no traveler, nothing. But the wind spoke again, muffled now, like an echo coming from far below the plateau, where steep cliffs made listening easier. She frowned. She tightened her braid. "Not yet," she whispered. At evening, after smoke curled from the chimney and a stale loaf cooled on the sill, Mara sat on the lean log bench and tried to read through the wind patterns. She'd read about animal signs, coyotes and birds. But human signs, an unmarked presence, felt wrong and right. She felt watched rather than invaded. A stranger's eyes, not violent, just curious. She placed a flat stone over the loaf to keep the chill out. She laid a trimmed channel in the dust by the door. A track. A footprint. She let the wind fill the cabin with cold. She knelt there, studied impressions until her knees ached. Then she counted the evening stars, traced constellations by memory. She spoke the ones she'd learned as a child. She fell asleep with barley in her stomach and uncertainty in her bones. Night came soaked in wind. A storm rolled in, fast. By midnight, a howl rushed across the plateau, rattling boards, stirring dust. Mara awoke, heart pounding. She grabbed the lamp and rushed to the window, heart frozen. Rain, not storms, but soft drizzle, began sliding over stones. She watched through grit-blurred glass. No human. But at first light, the tracks lay clear. Boots. No spurs. Boot patterns, smooth sole, single row of nails. She knelt in the mud bed. She followed them. They entered the cabin, skirted her lean-to refuge, circled the well, then disappeared toward the ridge. The tracks were new. They led into wilderness she barely understood. She studied them. Took a photo in her mind. She pressed her cheek against her palm. I am seen, she thought, but not yet known. Over the next week, she worked twice as hard. She finished the door arch. She etched hinges from iron scraps she'd melted in the fire. The cabin's frame closed tight. She smoked rabbit and quail in the smokehouse. She carved spoons, traps, latches out of walnut. She framed shelves. She built a stable out back. When the wind shifted, she sharpened stakes and tied stones to the window frames. She would see her visitor, and if they meant harm, she would stand ready. Every morning, she left flour dust along the trail near the cabin. It was thin, just enough to record footprints. At dawn, she checked. Most days, nothing. Once, a boot heel had pressed into the trail, halved in flour, but had not been followed by another print. Why stop? Why look? Why flinch? She cleaned the flour, reset the traps, returned to work. Late one afternoon, as she labored at the garden fence, she spotted a single feather stuck in the gate, white-tipped, native grass-bound. Not her doing. A gift left on purpose. She picked it gently. It smelled of wind, not blood. She laid it on the fence post, taped it with sap. She stared for a long time. Then she drilled holes in fence board and etched tiny symbols, half bird feather, half barley stalk. A message. A boundary. She stepped back. She had responded. The land no longer felt entirely hers, but shared. That night, she sat by the cook fire, barley broth steaming in a tin bowl. She stared into embers until shadows played like watchers. Dried herbs, oregano, sage, perfumed, warmed. She closed her eyes. She tasted flavors she'd never sewn to bread. Mountain salt, desert bitterness, something deep, almost sacred. She realized she'd walked inside her own story, mid-brutal labor, mid-new rhythms, mid-questions of identity. She was not alone, but she didn't know if that was blessing or burden. The wind rumbled agreement, or warning. Something broke inside her then, her first frontier breakdown. She fetched the lamp, brought it inside. Her hands trembled. Tools dropped. She sank. The cabin's walls pressed her in, too familiar, too final. She sank onto the floor. Held the feather tight. Tears came unbidden. Grief rose, the grief of divorce. The grief of uprooting. The grief of isolation. She thought of a voice, soft, an echo, maybe memory. You will not belong here alone. A man's voice? Her mind grasped. Or it was the land. Or spirit. Or longing. She stayed until dawn, until tears dried, until her back straightened. She readied the cabin, secured the latch, closed the draft. She put the feather on her kitchen shelf. It belonged there, more than any carved spoon. Dawn came, brittle and bright. She loaded her basket, headed down to a live creek she'd spotted 2 weeks past. She filled water jugs. She washed grains in basin. She rinsed sweat from her face. She knelt on stones. She cupped water to her lips. She sighed deep. In the water's reflection, she saw her own shape, lean, sun-cracked face, hair wild, hands lined. She looked hard. Stranger and survivor. She let the creek's current whisper into her skin. She began to speak aloud. I've built a home. I'll keep building. I'll keep waking. I'll keep claiming. But I'm not alone. The creek replied in ripple. The wind replied by feather-stirring trees. Weeks later, she woke to scattering footsteps, running toward her cabin. She grabbed the rifle taut across her back. She emerged to smoke rising at the ridge edge. She stood in the cabin doorway. The figure ran over crest, no horse now, but living being. Spear strapped across back, feathers fallen out. A man. Apache. Dark as earth, calm as mountain. His eyes met hers. He held up both empty hands, palms out. She hugged the rifle. Waited. The wind stilled. The day held its breath. The man knelt, laid a deer-hide pack. He whispered a name in Apache. Then she heard her own word in that name. A repetition. He stood. He tilted his head. He winked. Then walked away into dust. Mara lowered the rifle. She watched him leave. She closed the door. She sat at her workbench and picked up the carved spoon she'd made for dinner. She set face to the window, watched where he'd disappeared. A spot of movement, his figure receding. Her heart trembled, not with fear, but recognition. Not with dread, but awe. She stood. Walked outside. She picked up the same feather from beside the cabin, a second one now. She tied it to the spear stake outside. She whispered into the horizon. I see you. The frontier wind carried her name back. And she answered it. Mara stood on the ridge at dawn, the first light spilling over her cabin and the barley field she had coaxed from the hard, arid soil, and she closed her eyes as the wind carried a new sound. Not the whisper of earth or the cry of a vulture circling the mesa. Something different. It was a voice, low and certain, with a cadence she could not place. A greeting? An echo? She couldn't be certain. But it threaded into her bones and quickened the pulse at her throat. She dropped the bucket of water at her feet, dirt shifting beneath her boots. Her heart caught. She stepped forward, heading toward the canyon's mouth, where the land dipped and folded into shadow and silence. Who's there? She called out, voice steadier than she felt. No answer. Only the wind. Only her breath. Only the land waiting for her to claim it. She walked slowly into the canyon's lip, cautious but calm. She didn't raise her rifle. Not yet. She moved toward the place where the voice had come from, where breath met stone and eyes sharpened against the sun. Between boulders she glimpsed movement. A man. Not Apache uniform, but Apache skin, dark copper against dawn. He stepped out halfway, spear balanced across his shoulder, a bow slung low. He spoke again, that low, rolling sound. A word, then another. Perhaps a question. Mara paused. She lowered her hand from the rifle strap but kept it within reach, not because she expected violence, but because she had learned to honor preparedness. He watched her as she watched him. The canyon sun strengthened. Golden light warmed her scalp, stung her eyes. She squinted, searching his face. There was no armor, no aggression, just calm assessment, eyes that had carried the weight of more days than she had lived so far here. He lifted his hand, palm outward. She glimpsed the inside, a small tattoo of a half-moon, shaded dark. Matches a grain carving on her doorframe, an odd symmetry. But she did not react. She simply watched. He spoke again, a syllable that echoed, and then paused. She shook her head. He studied her carefully. Whatever tongue he spoke, they didn't share it. Stillness held them. Tension circled like water in a basin. The land waited. He crouched then, not lowering, just crouching, closer to the earth. He touched a stone. She watched his fingers trace lines worn by wind. Then he looked at her, nodded once, and pointed to the stone. A question? He stood. Walked forward, 2 steps, then paused again. He lifted a small pouch from his belt, opened it, held out a feather, similar to one she had placed by the fence. She swallowed. She moved forward then, slowly, holding her rifle with the barrel down. She slipped her thumb on the bolt so it wouldn't click if the rifle dropped. She stepped closer. He held the feather out, a silent offering. A message? Her heartbeat hammered. She reached out, palms open, honest. She took the feather. It was real, soft, meant. She ran her thumb across the downy white. She looked up and found his eyes, not strange, not hostile, just sharp and curious. A dust devil circled between them, lifted loose sand to dance at their feet. The creak of wood reminded Mara of the cabin. The shiver of dawn wind spoke of possibility. He spoke again, a simple word this time. Not English. Not French. Not Spanish. She shook her head. He repeated it slower. Mare. He enunciated it like a question. She blinked. My name, she said, voice thick. Mara. He nodded, eyes widening slightly, then repeated, Mare. He smiled faintly, surprised, pleased. He pointed to his chest, to a pendant, a small carved stone hanging from sinew. He said the word again, with rhythm this time. Tak-o-a. Mara's mouth went dry. She recognized the syllables she'd heard in the canyon voice. This was him. The deer-hide bag. The carved spoon. Tico. Tekoa. They held the silence. Then. Tico offered another feather, this one brown-tipped, smaller. He held it between thumb and forefinger. Mara traced it to the pouch at his belt, where more feathers lay. Different colors. Different meanings. She examined it, curious. He nodded, almost shyly. His gesture. She may keep the feather. Her gesture. May I trust you? Tico held his palm open again. She touched her palm to it, brief, careful. It was a touch she almost recoiled from, but didn't. Her body stayed. Her breath slowed. He pointed beyond the canyon. He motioned. Follow. She considered. Her cabin lay behind. Barley and harvest waited there. But she nodded. This afternoon, this fragile morning, was a new chapter. She slid the rifle to her back, grit shifting in the sling, and followed him. He crept nodding, leading them deeper into the canyon. The walls closed in. She stepped softly where he led. The air cooled. They passed a natural pool, its water still and deep. He touched the surface with his fingers. The ripple rolled in concentric rings. A mirror. She touched it, gently. He said the word again. Tekoa. She nodded. Mara. He guided her to a place he'd cleared between stone slabs where soft grass grew. He knelt. Bashfully retrieved a small bundle, wrapped in bark. He untied it. Opened. Inside, roasted berries on a leaf, bits of dried meat, wild onions. He held it toward her. A gift. She stared, stunned by kindness that spoke louder than his presence. She set the rifle down. She picked up the bundle. She ate. He ate too, fine quick bites. They ate in silence. Until he stood. He threw down the pouch, closed. A challenge. A closure. He said her name, Mara. Points south. There, her land. Points north. There, his. He opened his arms wide, land claimed. He said softly, together. Their fence between worlds lay in his gesture. She felt it in her bones. Yes. Yes, she said, clinging to courage. Together. They sat then, eating quietly as the sun warmed their shoulders. Silence, yes, but no longer hostility. It was trust born slowly. No words, just respect. Mara sketched her fingers in the dust, a goat skull. He recognized it, then traced a goat and arrow. She drew barley stalk. He nodded. Communication shifted. He traced his neck. Tekoa. She traced hers. Mara. He smiled. For the first time since her divorce, She felt seen for who she was. Not a widow, not alone, not broken. She was Mara. They sat until sunset. When light faded, she rose. Felt the weight of his presence in the cooling air. She bowed. One movement. Respect. He knelt, touched his chest. Mara touched hers. The canyon wind answered. They parted there. Different no longer, but not the same, either. A delicate bridge built where words were scarce. Mara walked back to the cabin in twilight. She held the two feathers, white and brown, pressed to her chest. The barley stalks leaned in. She traced circle tokens on her cabin door, two feathers tied to the jamb. She closed the door, set the rifle inside, and fed the cook fire. She paused in the firelight, aware of the wind curving around the cabin. Not intrusion, but invitation. The night held promise. She stepped outside into cool air. She whispered his name aloud. Tekoa. The wind whispered back. And for the first time on this homestead, Mara Campbell went to sleep knowing she was not alone. Dawn's light crept tenderly across the edge of the horizon as Mara awakened, still feeling the warmth of yesterday's encounter glimmering beneath her skin. She lay beneath an old quilt, one she'd stitched herself, heart thumping with quiet wonder. For the first time since arriving, the cabin had felt like a home, not a refuge. In her dreams, she heard Tekoa's name whispered like prayer over shifting sands. Liberty, she thought. This was the taste. She rose silently, pressing a hand against her chest. Sameness, no, insight, lingered. She stepped outside, pacing toward her newly built fence, checking its lines where barley ran wild and strong. She found the two feathers still bound to the post, white against brown, speechless ambassadors of yesterday's bridge. Her hand reached for them without thought. Beyond the fence lay the stretch of carved earth, dust and stones and barriers she'd erected to claim her future. But there, woven into the churn, were prints. Human ones, sometimes boot-sole, sometimes bare, more often moccasin tread, rounded in arcs that led from her gate toward the well, her steps stretching past the cabin and onward toward the river's rim. She traced them with her fingers, trailing cold dust into the warmth of her palms. Shoes told a story. Prints told history. These were Tekoa's, pressed gently but surely into her world. Her gaze drifted westward through the canyon to bluffs where the sun caught gleaming rock. He'd come. He'd walked this land. She exhaled slowly. The weight of truth landed like gold. Tekoa approached from the cabin's shadow. He moved at her back, fluid, like deer stalking through morning grass. She didn't need to turn. She felt his presence in the shift of air between them. Beyond him, her land spread like promise. He stepped quietly, nearly brushing her shoulder. Mara steadied herself. No fear. Just wonder. He paused to watch her inspect the prints. He uttered her name, soft, wordless, but enough. Enough to anchor her in clarity. Taka. Her chalice-shallow invitation. He nodded and crouched, smoothing dust over one of the boot prints she'd made to track progress. He pressed his hand to his chest, then pointed to the prints, his pattern, and then to her heart. We share this. The dirt hears us together. She snagged the feather from the fence post and handed it to him. He took it, brushed it against his hair, nodded. On her skin, palm flat, he pressed his fingers to her cheek. Earth and human merged. His eyes glowed like embers unseen. You come, he said. In English this time. One syllable. A gift. The morning moved quietly after that. They walked together, unhurried, toward the barley patch. The pale green blades quivered in the wind. Mara bent to run fingers over their tips. He did the same, mirroring. He pointed to the roots, soil she'd tilled, holes from where rocks were pulled, then nodded. Grow. He pointed to the sky. Rain. She pressed her fingers skyward and closed her eyes. She tasted the damp promise of clouds rising. She lowered her hand to the earth. He scooped a fistful and breathed in. Soil, she thought. Land. Life. He dropped the dirt back, like laying a prayer, not a claim. They walked to the smokehouse next. There, she removed a rack of quail she'd cured. She handed him a piece wrapped in cloth. His fingers brushed hers, a flicker of warmth. He unwrapped it, sniffed, cried a sharp nod. Eat. She joined him, chewing quietly, catching sparks of mutual respect. Between munches, she mimed, "Thank you." He nodded. The day brightened and bladed into heat. She invited him inside the cabin. Wooden walls carved, table cleared. She gestured to straw that might be used for bedding, and mirrors he'd probably never seen, a small smoky hand-glass. He peered into it, saw his face, turned unsure and pleased. She laughed, a soft exhale of humanity, and he joined mid-chuckle as he saw wariness and kindness swirl in each other's reflected eyes. They realized they were asking the same question. How much could they share? They shared it with bread, chewing, before the bakery began, with barley flour she baked that morning. She tucked it into his palm. His nod was shy, profound. She realized she held space for him fully, hands open, not empty. Late afternoon, she suggested he sit on the porch with her. She climbed the ladder to the loft, just a low, lean space, and descended with a board she'd built. Flat, smooth, etched with board games she'd invented in her solitude. Chuck holes and scratches marked kernels, counting dots. He crouched before it. She pointed to the marks, showed the pattern. He nodded. She set stones and sticks in place. He mirrored exactly. They played in dust, gently. Win or lose meaningless. But he smiled. Twilight came. She asked him to stay for dinner. He hesitated but stepped inside. Wind rattled boards. She found freshwater broth, sweetgrass simmered. One bread loaf. She placed 2 cups. Telescoped them, audio, but not spoken. He sipped, iced down. Then he swallowed, nodded. Enough. Present. At evening's end, he helped with chores outside. She built fire within the cabin. He gathered kindling. She lit the flame. They watched coals bloom in silence. Friendship built like that, no words, just flames. He lifted his bow across his chest, sign of guard. She returned the gesture, hand on belt, pistol there. Not a threat. A protection ritual. Then he bowed. She bowed. They parted, no ceremony, no goodbye. Emotion between unsaid curves. That night Mara lay in the loft, the board game stones swept up, the 2 feathers resting between quilt folds. Her hands reached for both. She held them, closed her eyes. She thought, a stroke across a blank canvas. Land claimed. Trust begun. Future unimaginable. She pressed the feathers to her heart and drifted into the first full sleep she'd had since she planted her barley. That first night after meeting him, Mara dreamed of them walking beneath giant cottonwoods. Their hands clasped. Dust softened to green. She smiled, awakened to silence and stillness. At dawn, she descended lightly, stepped out, and looked. Wind had reshaped the prints. Ridges blurred. But the heart remained. Mara smiled. Tekoa returned at noon, bringing a wood pack, deer wood logs he'd felled nearby. He tossed them near her door. She approached, heart hammering. He smiled, wonder that she noticed. She thanked him, one word in Apache she'd learned, wagone. He nodded, surprise, delight. Afternoons blurred. Days folded into new rhythms. Mara and Tekoa worked side by side, she clearing stones for a garden plot, he setting stakes for fencing. Their shadows fell across the barley. Their hands met at the axle of the wheelbarrow. They did chores in tandem, fresh water, smokehouse checks, cabin clearing. Silence heavier than words but richer. One evening, Mara found mud on the porch, Tekoa's footsteps traced toward the creek. Worry tugged. She called his name softly. No answer. She ran. Found him kneeling on the creek's edge, cupping water. Tekoa. She stepped forward. He looked up, eyes gentle and still. He repeated her name in his tongue. She responded same. He motioned. Drink. He filled her cupped palms. The water shimmered. Life glimmered in that pool, reflected between them. Branches rustled. No one else. All they carried spoke. Trust had grown roots. Under an open sky, Mara removed the feathers from her quilt and bound them to the fence post, white and brown intertwined. She tied them firmly, then stepped back. Tekoa approached, craned his neck, balanced the sign. He reached out. They touched the feathers together. A ritual of belonging. Night drifted peaceful as water. Mara lay beneath canvas, the scent of barley and sage heavy in the air. Her dreams were soft but present. Mountain wind, barley stalks brushing travelers' legs, a gentle voice saying finally, "Not alone." The summer dusk was unusually quiet. Not a single crow flew overhead, and even the crickets seemed hesitant to hum. Mara sat on the edge of her garden fence, her fingers tangled in the coarse hem of her apron. Across the field, the barley waved in lazy arcs, but her eyes weren't on the stalks tonight. They were drawn toward the canyon's lip, where sunlight faded too quickly for the hour. Tekoa hadn't come today. She tried not to read too much into it. He didn't visit every morning. Sometimes days passed before he returned, usually bringing firewood, or a carved trinket, or simply himself. But this time felt different. The last few days, he'd been unusually quiet. Thoughtful. He'd stood longer by the stones north of the cabin, the ones she had thought were just odd rubble from a collapsed wall. She'd once offered to move them, and he'd gently taken her hand and said, "No, no more. No less." Now, she couldn't help but stare at those very stones, bathed in the last honey light of day, glowing faintly like sentinels. Something shifted inside her. Curiosity, concern, maybe the first threads of fear. She rose from the fence, brushing off her apron, and moved toward the stones. She reached them and knelt, the fabric of her skirt catching on thorns. The stones were warm, despite the hour. She pressed her palm flat against one, feeling an old, bone-deep heat. She squinted in the dim light. There, barely noticeable, etchings. Faint lines. Curves. Spirals. Not natural. Not by chance. She ran her fingers over the grooves, barely breathing. Symbols. Ancient ones. She remembered Tekoa's pause here. The way he had looked down, almost reverently. Mara sat back on her heels, suddenly cold despite the lingering warmth. Her fingers trembled. This wasn't just a wall. This wasn't her land in the way she had believed. She ran back to the cabin, heart racing, grabbed the lantern and returned. She lit it, crouched low, and held it near the stone surface. Now the markings showed themselves fully, a circle divided in 4 quadrants. A hawk. A winding river. The symbol of fire. And one more, something like a ladder or a tree without leaves. Together, they told a story. A sacred one. She didn't understand it, but she knew enough to know this wasn't hers to move. Not without consequence. She felt it now, the wind shift, the silence of dusk, the way the barley seemed to lean away from the stones. Mara backed away, lantern flickering. Tekoa had known. That's why he'd come in peace. That's why he had never crossed beyond this point without invitation. This wasn't just shared earth. This was holy ground. She stood in the field long after the sun had slipped behind the hills. The stars blinked awake, and her lantern hissed with a failing wick, casting faint light across the sacred stone. She didn't need more to understand. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but reverence, a weight she had never expected when she signed her name on a deed. In the quiet, the air pulsed with something older than ownership, older than any cabin she could ever build. For the first time, Mara felt like a visitor on her own land. She crouched beside the markings again and whispered aloud, "I didn't know." The words vanished in the wind. Her throat tightened. She rose to her feet and walked back to the cabin, every step heavier. The barley whispered against her skirt like disapproving hands brushing past. Inside, she poured a cup of water, but didn't drink. She sat with her back against the door and stared into the dying fire. If Tekoa had known this place was sacred, if he had let her build here anyway, then his silence wasn't passive, it was merciful. And that meant this peace she had created wasn't built on solitude. It was built on grace. The next morning, she rose before the first light. She washed her face in the cool well water and dressed without sound. She gathered a small bundle, dried meat, a clean cloth, her hand-carved spoon, and walked toward the trail that led toward the canyon. She didn't bring the rifle. She wanted her hands empty. She walked for hours, until the stone walls around her narrowed, and the trees thickened. Birds stirred in the canopy, but she ignored them. She called his name once, then twice. Tekoa! The wind carried no answer. Then, as she turned back toward the rim, she saw him. Standing above her, on a ledge. Tall. Still. Watching. She stopped. Raised her arms slightly. "I found it," she said softly. "I saw the stones." He didn't move. I didn't know. Still, no movement. But he was listening. "I never meant to build on sacred ground." She dropped the bundle at her feet, stepped back from it. "I won't stay where I'm not welcome." Silence. Wind pushed dry leaves across the trail. Then, slowly, Tekoa climbed down. His moccasins barely disturbed the gravel. He walked past the bundle and came to stand in front of her, not close enough to touch, but close enough to look her in the eyes. He stared for a long time. Then he knelt. With a stick, he drew in the dirt, 4 lines, forming a box. Then a hand reaching in from one side. A smaller hand inside. He looked up at her. "This land," he said slowly, carefully, "is for memory." She nodded. He pointed at the sky. "Sky watches." He pointed at her chest. "Heart remembers." He rose. Mara swallowed hard. "Can I stay?" He was silent again, then took a deep breath. He walked past her and back toward the homestead. And she followed. Back on the field, he stopped again at the stones. This time, he knelt, removed a small pouch from his belt, and poured a pinch of red ochre into his hand. He dusted it gently across the markings. Then he offered the pouch to Mara. She took it with reverence, mimicking his gesture. She added her own touch, only a pinch, only a breath of pressure. They stood there together as the wind moved over the field. Tekoa pointed to the barley. "You grow food." He pointed to the stones. "Let them grow spirit." Mara nodded. They would not be moved. Nothing would be built over them. The land would stay as it was, in that sacred corner. Not conquered, not claimed, just honored. That evening, Mara placed the ochre pouch on the mantel above her hearth. She didn't hide it in a drawer, or bury it in a box. It sat beside the first feather he had given her, and a stone from the ridge. She knelt in front of the fire, staring at them, not trophies, not signs of romance, but truths. Tekoa came to the porch just as dusk settled. He said nothing, but he sat with her, and they watched the fire together until the stars returned. The morning after the ochre offering, the wind rolled in heavy from the east, carrying with it the scent of cedar and something subtler, like warmed stone after a fire. Mara woke before the sun rose and sat in her cabin doorway, wrapped in the same quilt she had arrived with months ago. The colors were faded now. So was the woman who once wore shame like armor. But something new was unfolding. The sacred stones, those carved petroglyphs that had stopped her cold, remained untouched beyond the garden. And now, each morning, Mara found herself stopping there before her chores, brushing away leaves, placing a pinch of ochre or barley or sage beside them. She never stayed long. Just enough to say, "I remember." That morning, Tekoa came without sound. She didn't need to look to know. He brought with him cedar bark, bundles wrapped in cloth, and something wrapped tightly in deerskin. Without a word, he set them on the ground between them and knelt. She followed suit, fingers still clutching her quilt. He began to unwind the first bundle, strips of sweetgrass, dried white sage, willow bark. He spoke as he worked, voice quiet, more for the air than for her. Cedar smoke cleans memory. Not to forget. To keep. Mara nodded slowly. "I want to understand." Tekoa opened the deerskin parcel to reveal a small stone bowl. He added the herbs and lit them. Smoke rose, slow and blue. It twisted in the still air between them, coiling toward the sky. Mara closed her eyes and inhaled. For the first time in weeks, She felt the tension loosen across her chest. She reached for one of the cedar sticks and handed it to him. He placed it in the fire. The crackle felt like prayer. After the smoke ceremony, Tekoa stood and pointed toward the base of the canyon, just beyond the bend where the trees thickened. He motioned toward the stone bowl, then toward Mara. His expression wasn't demanding, it was patient. She nodded. "You want to show me something?" He nodded. She rose, tossed the quilt over the doorway rail, and followed. The trail was narrow, hidden between outcrops and tall reeds. It curved down toward the waterline, deeper into the kind of wilderness Mara hadn't dared venture alone. They walked in silence. Birdsong flitted through the trees, and once, a deer startled and bounded across their path. Tekoa never flinched, only tilted his head toward its direction, as though acknowledging kin. Eventually, they came to a clearing. It wasn't large, maybe the size of her cabin, but it felt larger than sky. At its center was a ring of stones, some blackened by old flame. Nearby stood a totem pole half buried in vines. Carvings had faded, but she recognized the hawk and river symbols from the petroglyphs. Tekoa approached the pole and laid his palm on it. "This is not forgotten," he said. Mara stepped closer. "This is your people's?" He nodded. "This place holds our naming, our leaving, our return." She bowed her head. Tekoa turned to her. "You come here. You leave something. Not wood. Not fire. What then?" "Truth." He gestured to the stone circle. Mara walked forward, knelt at its edge, and pulled something from her dress pocket, a button from her old coat. The last thing she'd kept from her married life. A reminder of who she had once been, and who she no longer was. She placed it inside the ring. Tekoa said nothing, but his face softened. Smoke from their earlier ceremony still clung to her hair. The air felt holy. Mara stayed on her knees for several minutes after laying the coat button down. The clearing around her remained still, heavy with breathless quiet. Not a single branch creaked. Not a bird stirred. She could feel the land watching, not in judgment, but with knowing. There was power here, but not the kind she'd feared when she first stepped onto this soil. This was the power of memory, of story, of things endured and carried. Tekoa sat across the ring from her, his body folded into quiet reverence. He didn't touch the stone. He didn't need to. His gaze held it all. And in that moment, she realized something vital. This wasn't a ritual built for performance. There was no need to bow, chant, or make offerings in the way she had read about in books. All that was required was presence. She looked across at him. His face had changed in the firelight, less guarded now, more like a man who had finally let someone step inside his silence. Not possess it, not fill it, just share it. "I left a man to come here," she said, the words rising slowly, like vapor off river stone. "Not because he beat me, not even because he hated me, but because I was never anything to him but useful. A quiet house, a place to lay his boots." Tekoa said nothing, but she could see something shift in his eyes. Recognition. She continued. "I didn't come to escape. I came to build. And now I think I built something on a place that already meant something before I ever showed up." Tekoa finally spoke. "You listen." She nodded. "I'm trying." He nodded, slowly. "That is enough." She felt something break open in her chest, an old, hardened pain that softened at the edges. He wasn't telling her that what she'd done was forgiven. He was saying it could be understood. And that was more precious than any absolution. They sat beside the stone circle until the fireflies came out, drifting lazily between stalks and shadow. When it was time to leave, Tekoa rose and offered her his hand. Not to lead, not to pull her forward, but simply to walk beside. She took it. Their hands did not clasp tightly. It was not the grip of lovers or soldiers or those who sought to claim. It was gentle, unintrusive, enough. They followed the narrow trail back to her cabin. The sky had turned deep blue. Stars blinked out one by one. As they neared the porch, Mara stopped. She turned to him. You want water? Food? Tekoa shook his head. Tomorrow. She nodded. Tomorrow. He turned, walked back the way they had come. This time, she didn't watch him until he vanished. She turned first, stepped into her home, and lit the fire with cedar bark he had left behind. The smoke curled upward, and her breath went with it. The first warning came in the silence. No birds. No wind. Even the barley field, always restless with motion, had gone still, each stalk stiff and upright, like soldiers before battle. Mara stood on the porch, one hand shading her brow, and watched the western sky darken. Not just with clouds. This was different. The color was wrong. A sickly gray-green that turned her stomach. She turned quickly, pulled the cabin door shut, and began gathering what she could. The garden tools. The barley sacks from under the porch. The bundles of dried quail she had hanging from the eaves. She moved like a woman possessed. Inside, she checked the window frames, tightened the leather fastenings, stuffed gaps with cloth. She closed the flue and drew the shutters. The wind began to howl. Not whisper. Not speak. Howl. A coyote cried out somewhere on the ridge. Then, as she reached for the latch on the front door, she saw Tekoa. Running. He crested the far ridge like he was chasing fire. His braid whipped behind him, shirt soaked from shoulder to waist. She had never seen him run before. His steps were usually measured, respectful, like he danced with the land. But now he charged through it, as if begging the earth to move faster beneath him. Mara flung open the door. He didn't need to say a word. "The river?" she asked. He nodded, breathless. "Rising." "How fast?" "Too fast." Her heart clutched. That meant the low valley behind the ridge would flood. And if the wind hit strong from the north, the water could curve up toward the barley. Or worse, toward the cabin. She didn't panic. She grabbed rope. Tekoa followed her to the small stable she'd built out back. Together they reinforced the posts with wet mud and gravel, pushed the feed crates to the highest platform. He pointed to the smokehouse. "Cover." She nodded. They piled stones against its base. Lightning struck behind the hills, a jagged tear in the sky. The boom that followed shook her ribs. She froze. Tekoa's hand landed on her shoulder. Steady. Grounding. They returned to the cabin, where she poured water from the well into every container they had. They might not be able to draw once the storm crested. Tekoa began stacking firewood inside, just enough for one night, maybe two. He glanced at her rifle by the door and nodded. She handed him extra rounds. She didn't ask why. There wouldn't be looters. Not out here. But animals. Desperation. You couldn't ever rule it out. By nightfall, the storm had become a thing with weight. It pushed against the cabin like a bear. Shutters thumped. Beams groaned. The wind crawled through the cracks she hadn't known existed. Rain came next, not in droplets, but in sheets. Loud, angry waves that beat down on the roof so hard she thought the boards would buckle. Inside, she and Tekoa sat by the fire. No words. There was nothing to say. Survival didn't need dialogue. At one point, the back door slammed open. Mara ran toward it, but before she could reach it, the wind yanked the hinges loose. The entire panel twisted sideways. She screamed, not in fear, but fury. Tekoa was already there. He grabbed the broken edge, shoved it inward, and pinned it with a wooden beam from the wall frame. Mara rushed forward with nails. Together, they sealed it again, barely. Rain poured through the crack beneath. They let it. Better wet than exposed. After midnight, the storm peaked. The cabin shook. The roof dripped in 5 places. But the fire held. And so did they. Mara sat with her knees drawn to her chest, watching Tekoa spoon ashes against the hearth wall, blocking the draft. He turned, soaked and wild-haired. Their eyes met. And for the first time, she saw something new in him. Fear. No. Determination. And in herself, not despair, but resolve. She crawled across the floor toward him and handed him the last dry blanket. He draped it over both their shoulders. And they sat that way until morning. At some uncertain hour between midnight and dawn, the wind gave up. Not slowly, but all at once. Like a bellows snapping shut. The rain softened to a drizzle, and the wild howl settled into a low moan. Mara awoke still wrapped in the shared blanket, Tekoa's shoulder against hers, his breath slow and even. She didn't move for several minutes. She listened. To what was gone. To what remained. When she finally stood, her knees cracked. The fire had died to coals, and the cabin smelled of wet wood and earth. A puddle had formed beneath the kitchen shelf. One window shutter dangled from its hinge. But the walls stood. The roof held. The house had not broken. Not like her first one. Not like her old life. She stepped outside barefoot, into the thin light of the new day. The land had changed. The barley field, flattened in patches, soaked to the root. The smokehouse, leaning slightly, but intact. The trail to the well, erased entirely. The air carried mud and cedar. The storm had not spared her. But it hadn't taken her, either. Tekoa came out behind her. He carried the same silence as the storm's wake. Not fearful. Not questioning. Just aware. He walked toward the barley, crouched, studied the stalks. He pinched one between his fingers and held it toward the light. It would recover. She could see it in his face. He rose and turned to her. "Strong roots," he said. Mara nodded. "Like you." He looked down. "No. Like this place. Like you." The words stopped her breath. Together they walked the perimeter, assessing damage. She pointed out the broken gate latch. He lifted the stone that had rolled into the porch corner. They stood side by side, gathering pieces of what had tried to fall apart. There was no bitterness in it, only the solemn work of healing. Inside, Mara boiled water for tea with the last dried herbs she had. Tekoa carved a new window fastener while she swept rainwater toward the door. The silence between them was a different kind now. Comfortable. Earned. By midday, sunlight broke through. It dappled across the field in scattered beams, gold spilling where gray had lingered. Mara stood with her hands on her hips, breathing it all in. She felt it, deep in her marrow. This was the turning. This was the mercy. Not that the storm hadn't come, but that she hadn't faced it alone. Later that day, Tekoa brought her a bowl carved from willow bark. Inside, cedar shavings, barley grains, and one of the feathers he'd once gifted her, now darkened with soot. He handed it to her with both hands. No words. She understood. He wasn't just offering thanks. He was giving her a piece of his memory, and asking for hers in return. She stepped inside the cabin, fetched the ochre pouch from the mantel, and poured a single pinch into the bowl. Then she added her button, the last relic of her old life. She handed the bowl back. He didn't look inside. He just held it, and nodded. They lit a small fire that night on the ridge, just enough for the bowl to burn. They didn't watch it go. They watched the sky. And for the first time, both saw the same thing. Not the storm behind, but the land ahead. Together. The frost came earlier than expected that year. One morning in mid-September, Mara stepped out with her hands wrapped around a steaming cup, only to find the barley silvered and bowing. Each blade stiff with ice, crackling under the weight of morning light. She didn't panic. Not anymore. She'd learned to read the land like a slow-burning book, one paragraph at a time. This wasn't the end of a chapter. Just a harsh sentence. One she'd have to walk through. Inside, she wrapped thick wool around the window frames, rechecked the smokehouse vents, counted the root cellar stores. Enough potatoes. Enough salted meat. If she was careful, it would last through December. But only just. Tekoa arrived just after midday, carrying his own sign of warning, a bundle of rabbit skins and wild plums, along with something heavier, wooden boards carved with symbols she'd never seen. He set them beside the hearth and gestured toward the ceiling. "Storm," he said. She nodded. Soon. He squatted near the fire. Soon enough. Over the next 3 days, they worked without speaking much. They reinforced the roof, patched the chimney draft, restocked the kindling box. Mara harvested what barley had survived the frost, and Tekoa carried it in 2 long sacks, balanced across his shoulders. It was a rhythm now. Their survival was a song sung in sweat and splinters, and every beat was shared. And yet, something unsaid lingered. Not tension, but waiting. One night, after the work was done, Mara made them tea from dried rosehips. They sat on the porch, feet up on the rail, the wind pushing cold air under their collars. She looked sideways at him. His jaw was set. His hands rubbed together slowly, like he was working something out with the bones. She asked, "Do you ever miss them?" He turned to her. "My people." She nodded. Tekoa took a long breath, then exhaled. "I never left." They did. Silence. "Taken." He shook his head. "Some taken. Some left. Some changed." She didn't press. Instead, she said, "Mine left too. Long before I came here." He looked at her with something like gratitude, then said slowly, "You stayed." Her throat tightened. "Yes." He nodded. And then he said a word in Apache, soft, musical. She didn't recognize it. He repeated it, then pointed to his chest, then to her. Then again, "Shil Hazo." She frowned. "What does it mean?" He hesitated, then whispered, "You make things whole." She looked away. The frost cracked beneath the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a fox cried out. She wiped her eyes before he could see. But she knew he already had. The next morning, snow fell for the first time. It was soft at first, lazy in its descent. But by mid-afternoon, the fields lay under a quilt of white. Mara watched it from inside, arms crossed, feeling both awe and a quiet ache. The cabin, though warm, had grown too silent. Tekoa hadn't come. She tried not to wonder, not to worry. She stoked the fire, chopped wood, moved jars from the root cellar upstairs just in case the cold crept in deeper. By evening, still no sign of him. She lit the lantern and set it in the window, an old trick from stories her mother used to tell. If someone was wandering, it meant, "This place is safe." She ate alone, bread and broth. Then she waited, and waited. Just past midnight, she heard the knock. Soft. Then again, 2 quick taps. She pulled open the door, heart leaping. Tekoa stood there, coated in snow, holding a small carved object in both hands. He stepped inside slowly, shaking the ice from his shoulders. Mara helped him peel off his coat, took the carving from him. It was a figure, made from juniper wood, no taller than her palm. A woman. Alone, standing between 2 barley stalks. Her own likeness. She looked up at him, startled. "You carved this." He nodded. "For you," he said. She blinked hard. "Why?" He hesitated. Then finally, his voice low, nearly breaking, he said, "Because I don't want to leave again." Her breath caught. Tekoa continued. "My people, when the cavalry came, we didn't just lose land. We lost voice. I stayed quiet because I thought silence was safer." She stepped closer. "But you changed that," he said. She reached for his hand, still cold from the night air. "I didn't come here to take anything," she whispered. "I know." He stepped forward. "Then say it," she said, voice shaking. He held her gaze, and said the word again. "Shil Hazo." You make things whole. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. But that night, they slept beneath the same quilt, no longer as guests of circumstance, but as something unnamed and more sacred. Something like truth. Outside, the snow continued to fall. But inside, the first warmth of a new winter had begun. Not from the fire, but from the word that finally broke the silence. The spring sun blazed as though it hadn't learned mercy yet. Mara stepped outside to inspect the barley rows. Despite Frost's late departure, the land had revived, and green shoots rose resilient and bright. She kneaded her hands through soil, savoring the soft warmth that spoke of rebirth. From the ridge, Tekoa watched her, standing tall with hands on hips, presence unguarded yet undeniable. She smiled. He returned it. That brief moment of perfect calm, so rare out here. Then the wind shifted, sharp and dry-tempered. It roared down the canyon in a sandstorm of peppered air. Mara wiped grit from her eyes. She watched for the significance. Tekoa came beside her, scanning crystal-clear distance, then frozen. They both stared as a plume of smoke curled along the ridge's edge. Pale at first, it quickly migrated into orange-gray, thick and threatening. Fire. Not too far, but close enough. It swept toward them faster than the wind. They sprang into action. Mara hooked her belt, her rifle and flint pouch, ready. Tekoa snatched axe and knife. They raced to the barn, through open doors, corralled trapped animals into the smokehouse, propped stones around the door to block embers. Fire crackled on the ridge, rolling downward in pop-and-snap motion across scrub and grass. Sparks rained across the plateau like embers from wild wings. Tekoa worked with sure steps, stomping down grasses, creating fire breaks. Mara followed, dampening barley, dribbling water, placing wet blankets across the cabin's roof vents and lower walls. Their laughter had gone silent. Survival was urgent work. The fire's edge neared. The heat hit first, a dry wave that suddenly stripped moisture from lungs. Mara coughed. Tekoa looked back to her, eyes urgent. They had trained for storms, winter, frost, flood, but not this heat, this threat. They soaked blankets again, pressed them along barley rows and the cabin wall. Ember fell, sizzling, smoking, against nearest board. Mara lifted the blanket, slapped. Fire died. Another ember struck. This time near the smokehouse. Tekoa moved, axe held high, not to chop, but to clear fallen brush. Mara followed with water. The fire flickered. Circles of protection offered reprieve. But the ridge fire still roared. They could not beat nature alone. Just then, a whip of wind surged, rolling one curtain of flame toward the cabin's southwest. Mara froze. This was beyond them. She raised her voice. "We call it off. We need help." A horn sounded from her shoulder. The commotion had drawn the neighbors. They crashed up, Tom Wiley with his shotgun, Theta jackhammer footsteps. Others followed, ranch hands and travelers. They'd seen the smoke from miles. Bystanders became helpers in a heartbeat. Tekoa didn't speak, he just merged with the group, giving commands with nods. Mara directed water from barrel buckets. Tom splashed veranda stones with slurry. The neighbors worked fast, instinctual. Within an hour, the firebreak held. The ridge blaze burned out in one last brutal wave. The plateau lay black where the fire cut ran. Smoke billowed out like guilt. Ash drifted across the barley. The cabin wall bore singed shingles. The smokehouse roof had a scorch mark. But beyond that, the land was safe. Neighbors patted their backs. Some offered water, food from iron pots. Words of relief and respect. Tom slapped Tekoa's back. "You and this woman saved us all." Tekoa bowed his head. Mara swallowed tears. Not fear, not grief, but pride in what they'd done together. That night, the community gathered, silent vigil at the fire pit. No speeches. No bands. Just presence. Mara poured herbs from her root cellar. Juniper, sage, slow-spoken prayers. Tekoa added cedar bark. They burned their mixture. Smoke drifted into a clearing sky, carrying gratitude. They inhaled its medicine. Two neighbors approached Mara, Frank and Jess Wiley. "You haven't lost it," Frank said, eyes soft. "That patch. We'll come back richer than before." Jess offered a loaf, fresh-baked. "For you and yours." Mara accepted, nodded. She looked at Tekoa. He'd never looked more at home than now, wreath of smoke circling his head like a crown. Later, when the fire waned, she and Tekoa walked to the burned ridge. Stars overhead. Ember pockets still glowed inside root mats. She sank to her knees, touched a single charred stalk. "I thought I'd lose everything," she whispered. "And I almost did." Tekoa knelt too. He placed his hand across hers. He stared out where darkness and ash blurred. "You didn't." She felt pride rise, stirring a sense of unbreakable roots through her bones. He squeezed her hand and said the word again, "Shil Hazo." She closed her eyes, repeating it. Her breath warmed her chest. They rose and walked home together. No need for words, no need for ceremony. The smoke was prayer enough. In the days after the fire, the land smelled like iron and forgiveness. Mara walked the perimeter each morning, bare boots brushing over blackened earth, counting what had survived and what hadn't. The barley patch, scorched in patches, had already begun sprouting new shoots, green rising through ash. It wasn't just nature's resilience. It felt personal, like the land was telling her, "You've been seen. You've been spared." Tekoa returned each day with small offerings. One day, a necklace made from river stones. Another, a carved spoon. Once, a single hawk feather placed quietly beside her door. Each gift was wordless, but they spoke volumes. And each evening, Mara left something for him too. A clean cloth folded on the bench, a loaf wrapped in sage, once even her father's old knife, reforged from rust and polished until it gleamed like purpose. The townspeople had changed, too. Tom Wiley dropped by with fence wire and said, "For the future." Jess brought flour without asking, then sat on the porch like she belonged there. No one asked why Mara and Tekoa worked side by side, or why his bedroll now stayed in the cabin more often than not. Some things don't need explaining when the smoke has cleared. One dusk, as Mara stitched a torn hem beside the fire, Tekoa came to sit across from her. The flames made shadows dance between them. "I saw someone today," he said quietly. She looked up. "Someone from the tribe?" He nodded. "An uncle. Passed this ridge during hunt. Said the fire smoke told him this place still breathes." Mara swallowed. "Will he come back?" Tekoa shook his head. "He said he already knows." "Knows what?" Tekoa looked straight at her. "That I'm where I'm meant to be." She dropped her needle. He reached for it, handed it back. Fingers touched. Neither of them let go. The next morning, Mara rose early and climbed the ridge. She carried 2 feathers, his and hers. At the old firebreak, where black gave way to new green, she knelt and placed them side by side. Then she stood and whispered the word he had taught her, not as an echo, but as a vow. Shil Hazo. She didn't need to understand every syllable. She felt them in her bones. Wholeness had walked through fire, and come out standing.